Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is Prorevenge story. When I was in college in the early 2000s, I met Ryan, then M23, through mutual friends. He had already graduated and was planning to move to the opposite side of the United States for grad school, and I had already been making plans to move with friends only a 90-minute drive away from where he was moving to. We had so much in common, fell in love, and it really seemed like fate, both planning to move 3,000 miles and landing so close together. He had two sisters and a younger brother who were all awesome people, and I became instant friends with them as well. Because he was in school and I was working, I would usually go to him to hang out on weekends. He was renting a house with two roommates also in his program. We were young, so money was tight, but we had fun, went for taco dates, and spent a lot of time at his house where he was breeding and selling small animals. Ryan was an animal sciences PhD student, so being around animals was normal, and I loved it. I met and became friends with his advisor's wife, Diane, F. mid-50s, who worked in administration at the university. She is a lovely woman, and I would often have lunch with her when I went over on weekends. Ryan was a teaching assistant, TA, and I met other people in the program and made friends with them faster than he did. After about 2 years of dating, I was at the house one day, laying in bed together in a state of some undress, and he said out of the blue, "I'm concerned you've been gaining weight and it makes it harder for me to be attracted to you." No concern about my health, it was all about him finding me unattractive. I sat up and said, "Well, then maybe you should make sure there is better food for me to eat than crackers and cheese when I come up on weekends." Even at 23, I didn't take that kind of BS. I had gained maybe 10 pounds since meeting him 2 years earlier and still wore the same size clothes, about a US size 6, 8. I wasn't going to engage in a fight about it after all. It was his problem, not mine, so I asked him calmly, "So what is your solution to this?" He stared at me blankly and said, "Well, I guess that you should try to lose weight." I said, "Nah, I'm not going to do that, so what are you going to do about it?" He said, "Well, I guess nothing. I wanted to let you know how I feel." I replied, "Cool, thank you." Put my clothes back on, went to sleep, and drove home the next day as usual. We kept dating, and about 3 months later he called me and said he wanted to break up after close to 3 years. The reason? And I quote, "You don't know enough about science." He felt like he couldn't have a conversation with me about his work where he didn't have to use common names for animals instead of scientific ones. I said, "Well, that's bullcrap. What's the real reason?" He insisted, "No, that's the real reason." He came to see me a month later to return something of mine, and I confronted him, demanding the real reason. "I need to know what actually happened between us, Ryan. I deserve the truth," I said, standing my ground. He finally admitted he had been seeing one of his undergrad students, let's call her Amber, a 19-year-old. He was then 26 and her teacher. "You've been cheating on me with one of your students? Are you kidding me?" I screamed at him to leave. My roommate threatened to throw him off our second-floor balcony if he didn't go, and he left. It hit me all at once after he walked out, and I went from rage to stunned laughter. I'd met Amber a few times, and at one point she was at his house for a BBQ and spilled something all over her pants. Ryan asked me if I could loan her some sweats. I couldn't because I was a size 8 and she was a size 18. Nothing wrong with that at all, but the point is, I realized he made those comments about my weight to try and get me to break up with him because he was a coward. He clearly liked a big gal. Although, when he'd said those things to me about my weight, it was 1 a.m., I lived about 95 miles away, and we had just had sex, so I don't know how he thought this would go. Even in hindsight, it perplexes me. Did he think I was going to break up with him and storm off into the night and drive for an hour and a half? Anyway, I emailed his roommates. I wanted to let them know we'd broken up and that they were always lovely to me and thanked them for being friends. They both admitted they knew about Amber and were the ones to demand that Ryan tell me or they would. That's when he broke up with me with the lame, "you don't understand science" excuse. One of his roommates, a super nice, super cute guy named Lucas, offered to help me get a few things still at their house that he had collected for me away from around the house. He suggested I come up for the weekend. We go out and drink and have a good time. All the things Ryan didn't want to waste money on, and I said sure. So I went up and Lucas let me into the house while Ryan was gone. I took photos of all of his animals because while I might not be a PhD student, I paid attention and I knew he had an endangered species in his care. He wasn't breeding it, it was an unreleasable animal he had taken in from a rescue organization. There was paperwork he had to submit with a $25 fee, and he refused to do it, saying he didn't want the government in his business. "Look at this," I said to Lucas, pointing at the animal. "He knows this is protected, right? And he's just ignoring the rules?" "Oh, yeah," Lucas sighed. "He thinks the regulations are stupid and don't apply to him." I took photos of that animal, all his breeding conditions, and a photo of an animal not allowed in the state which was in a tank. right next to a window and visible from outside. I then went out for a night on the town with Lucas. We stumbled in early, around midnight, so Ryan and Amber, who were watching TV, would see me in a short dress, drunk, and Lucas practically carrying me. "Look who's back," I said loudly as we walked past them. "Don't mind us, we're just having a little fun." I spent the night in Lucas's room. He was a total gentleman, but made sure to leave the room and parade past them in his boxers a few times, and we giggled and moaned loudly so they could hear us. When I went to leave the next morning, Ryan said I didn't have to act like a whore in front of him as I ate a donut slowly in my rumpled dress with messy hair while Lucas beamed at me and then planted a kiss on my head. "Really?" I said, taking another bite of donut. "That's rich coming from you." Amber looked ashamed, not quite knowing where to look, and I said, "Have fun with my leftovers," and walked out. I wanted to think the petty, loud, hook up, and a few juvenile insults was my revenge. It was not. The next day, I had my photos developed, this was before smartphones were everywhere, and called the State Office of Fish and Wildlife. I reported the animals in the house, the potential overcrowding of breeding animals, and the 2 animals he shouldn't legally have at all in the state, and asked them how to make a report. "I want to make sure I'm doing this right," I explained to the officer on the phone. "I have photos documenting everything." "You're doing exactly the right thing," the officer assured me. "We'll investigate this thoroughly." Turns out Ryan wasn't well liked by his peers in his program or by his roommates, but I was. Lucas had suggested that he and their other roommate could submit complaints to the university that a TA was sleeping with one of his students and showing her favoritism. The night we were out at the bars, we made sure to tell the story to anyone who they knew. "You won't believe what our roommate is doing," Lucas would say. "He's sleeping with one of his students." They made sure all the women in his classes knew he was sleeping with Amber. It wasn't a large program, so people knew fast he had cheated and was now dating his student. Lucas and the other roommate made sure people knew they had put in complaints, sick of Ryan's entitled BS. With my full statement made and photos sent to the state wildlife officials, I called my friend Diane, Ryan's advisor's wife. She knew about the breakup and lame reason, and I let her know he admitted he was sleeping with a student. I'd been messaging with him, and he admitted to it in writing, so I sent that to Diane. "I can't believe this," Diane said, her voice tense with anger. "This is completely inappropriate and violates university policy." To say she was not happy about that was an understatement. She said she made sure it would be investigated and told her husband, Ryan's direct advisor, while I was on the phone with her. Speaking of investigations, a few weeks later Lucas called me, giddy, to say state fish and wildlife officials were there, confiscating animals. "You should see his face," Lucas laughed over the phone. "He's absolutely losing it right now." He told them he would be happy to tell them whatever they needed to know. Amber was there when it happened and told the officials as far as she knew, all the animals belonged to her boyfriend Ryan and that they were all legal. That put Lucas and the other roommate in the clear. One animal was kept in the backyard, so it was implied to Ryan that a neighbor reported it. While they were there to investigate, they knew to look in the back window to see the far more problematic, illegal to have in the state under nearly any circumstances, animal. Since Lucas was on the lease, he was able to let them in to investigate in the house. The animals were all in communal areas, and the officers stayed there for a few hours and returned with a warrant to take all the animals and enter Ryan's room to investigate. Lucas and the other roommate let them into their rooms with no issues and were quickly cleared. Amber apparently couldn't get a hold of Ryan and eventually drove to the university to find him. It was a good day. The only animals they left were some guppies in a fish tank. Now, PhD students need grant money to do research, and a large part of animal studies funding comes from the federal government. Ryan had just gotten an EPA grant right around when he broke up with me, so I called the EPA and asked how I would report that a person with a federal grant was being investigated for illegally harboring endangered animals. I believe there's an ethical issue with someone receiving government funding while simultaneously violating wildlife protection laws, I explained to the EPA representative. Long story short, he lost his EPA grant and had to make restitution on what had already been used, close to $30,000. He would never be able to get another federal grant. He avoided jail time on the state charges since all the animals were in good health, but lost all his breeding animals, worth thousands of dollars, since they were collected for safekeeping during the investigation when the 2 illegal animals were taken. In the end, he owed a $15,000 fine, and the 2 animals went to a nearby nature center. For years, I would stop by if I was in the area to visit them. The university revoked his scholarship and fired him from teaching for having an inappropriate relationship with a student. He somehow escaped being expelled, but it always shocked me that he never tried to hide the relationship with Amber and was so stupidly self-assured he didn't even wait the 4 weeks until she would have been done with his class to start publicly dating her. By the university rules, he would have been in the clear to date her, not being her teacher anymore, and she would just have to avoid any classes he was a TA in. It never fails to make me laugh. After a few months, I emailed his sisters and told them I missed them because Ryan broke up with me after trying to call me fat and cheating on me, and I felt weird contacting them. I've really missed talking with you guys, I wrote, but I wasn't sure if I should reach out after what happened with Ryan. The girls told me he told the family I broke up with him because of the distance. Are you serious? I replied. He actually lied to you all about what happened? I forwarded them emails that Ryan wrote after the breakup, talking about how he fell for Amber and he was sorry about it, but it was true. I couldn't keep up with him academically, and it made him attracted to Amber. Ryan managed to convince his dad to pay for one more year of school so he could get a master's instead of a PhD, and while I stayed in contact with his sisters and brother via email and then social media, I largely let it all go. I got even, made some friends, Diane became like an auntie to me, and I went on with life. I went on to get a master's degree myself in my specialty, helping scientists and doctors communicate their work to lay people. You know, us dummies who can't remember all the scientific names, I swear it happened by accident, not design, but I love it, and I work with everyone from small-town doctors and nurses to pharmaceutical companies to museums to state and federal governments to film and TV producers. I travel a lot and speak and get to learn a lot of cool things about our planet and how things work. I knew through his siblings that Ryan and Amber got married and had 2 kids. Amber dropped out of the sciences and became an accountant. Ryan went back to breeding animals. Every once in a while, his sisters or brother would tell me something over lunch or via text, but we had our own relationship that exists outside of him. Apparently, when I sent a wedding gift for one of his sisters, he loudly complained at a co-ed bridal shower that all of his siblings still were my friend and didn't make an effort to embrace his now wife, Amber. "Why are you all still talking to her?" he had apparently demanded. "She's not family anymore." Apparently, the sister just laughed and said, "I don't make it a habit to be friends with homewreckers." This is how Ryan's parents found out how their relationship started and ours ended 10 years after we broke up. Ryan never found out I was behind reporting him to the state, and in the end, I didn't lie about a single thing, except maybe exaggerating a drunken makeout session with Lucas, who is now a successful and tenured professor with a lovely wife and daughters. Fast forward about 20 years to a few weeks ago. I was at a university giving a lecture to a room of 250 undergrad and grad students. At the end, I was mingling with the students afterwards, and I hear a voice say, "Hey, is that you?" And I realize it's Ryan, and I didn't change the expression on my face at all. I was completely shocked, and my instinct was to play dumb, so I said, "I'm sorry, help me out. Have we met at another workshop or lecture?" He looked incredulous and said, "It's me, Ryan." I squinted slightly, tilting my head. "Ryan? I'm not placing you." Finally, I gasped and said, "Oh my goodness, Ryan, I guess I blocked you out," and said, "Well, lovely to see you," and moved on quickly when he tried to reach out and hug me. I was happy to leave it there, with the satisfaction of him seeing me as a guest lecturer in a science department of a major university when he was just in the audience. The department chair and faculty who had invited me to speak took me out to dinner, and while there, one of them said, "So you know Ryan?" I said, "I did from over 20 years ago," being vague about how. She went on to tell me he had been there for an interview for a teaching position and had spent a few days there observing, and they were likely going to hire him. I couldn't control it, I scoffed. When they all looked at me, I said, "I'm sorry, I'm just shocked he's teaching after what happened at University X." "What happened?" the department chair asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. I said, "He was sleeping with a 19-year-old student when he was 26, and he had to leave the program without a PhD because he couldn't afford to stay after losing his scholarship." The 3 people I was with all looked at each other like they knew they had a problem and said, "Wow, we'll have to look into that," and changed the subject. My old friend Diane, retired a year or 2 now, but still friendly with her old colleagues, called me this weekend to say a friend at the university let her know someone had called doing a background check about Ryan, and they pulled his file, which included being fired, leaving the program with a lower degree, and the complaint letters from over 20 years ago about his conduct. "They found everything," she told me with satisfaction in her voice. "Every single detail from back then. Diane's name had been on it with her husband listed as the faculty advisor, so she thought she'd like to know. As a bonus, it had a copy of his arrest record for the illegal animals. I guess his dad had paid for a decent lawyer to get the record expunged after the charges were reduced, and he paid the fine so it doesn't show up on a standard background check. I don't think he's going to get that job." "They told me there's no way they're hiring him now," Diane confirmed. The background check was damning, so I will return to my life, content that the universe comes through sometimes, especially if you give it a little nudge now and then. The best revenge is when you don't have to do anything wrong, you just have to help direct knowledge to the right places. If there is anything I can impart to any young women and men reading this, as I shimmy happily into my now size 10 pants, it's that, if someone who is supposed to love you complains about your weight or looks, that is their problem to fix mentally, not yours, and maybe it's time to check out what they are doing behind your back or simply move on. Remember though, it is their flaw, not yours. If Ryan hadn't been a coward and tried to make me break up with him and just ended things with me in a mature way, I might not have found out about Amber and turned his own wickedness back on himself. The next one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd end up in a property dispute with my neighbors, but here we are. This whole mess started about 6 months after I bought my house. A nice little place on the edge of town with a decent chunk of land attached to it. The property came with about 2 acres, which included a small wooded area and a long gravel driveway that connected to the main road. When I first moved in, everything seemed fine. My neighbors to the east were an older couple who kept to themselves, and I barely saw them except for the occasional wave. But then they moved out, and that's when my problems began. The new neighbors who moved in were a middle-aged couple, and the wife immediately struck me as the type who needed to be in control of everything around her. Within the first week, she was already walking around the property line, taking photos with her phone and making notes. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured she was just getting familiar with the area. The trouble started when I came home from work one day to find an old sedan parked right across my driveway entrance. Not beside it, not near it, but directly blocking the entire width of the driveway. I couldn't get in. I sat there in my truck for a minute, thinking maybe someone was just turning around or something, but no one came out. I walked up to the neighbor's house and knocked. The wife answered, and I politely explained that someone had blocked my driveway. She looked at me with this expression that I can only describe as smug satisfaction and told me that was her car. I asked her to move it, and that's when things got weird. She informed me that I had been using her driveway without permission, and she was putting a stop to it. I was confused because I had the survey documents from when I bought the house, and the driveway was clearly on my property. I tried to explain this, but she cut me off and said she had done her own research and the driveway was actually on her land. She claimed the previous owners had just been nice enough to let me use it, but those days were over. I went back to my truck and had to park on the street, then walk up the driveway to my house. This was inconvenient, but I figured I'd sort it out reasonably. I pulled out my property survey and deed, made copies, and brought them over the next day. I showed her the documents that clearly indicated the driveway was on my property, about 15 feet inside my property line actually. She barely looked at them, just waved her hand dismissively and said surveys could be wrong, that she had talked to someone who told her the land had been improperly divided years ago, and that her property actually extended to include my driveway. She had no documents, no proof, just her word and apparently some conversation with someone she wouldn't name. For the next 2 weeks, she kept parking cars in my driveway. Sometimes it was her car, sometimes her husband's truck, sometimes both. I'd come home and have to park on the street. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter and I'd need to take it up with a lawyer. I contacted a property attorney who confirmed what I already knew. The driveway was definitely mine, and she was trespassing. The attorney sent her a formal letter explaining the property boundaries and demanding she stop blocking my access. Her response was to double down. She sent back a letter claiming that even if the driveway was technically on my property, she had established an easement through continuous use. This made no sense since she had only lived there for a few weeks, but logic didn't seem to be her strong suit. Then came the demand that would become my opportunity for malicious compliance. She marched over to my house one evening and told me that since I insisted the driveway was mine, I needed to maintain it properly. She complained that there were potholes developing, the gravel was getting thin in places, and as the landowner, it was my responsibility to fix it. She said if I didn't maintain my property properly, she'd report me to the county for creating a hazard. I just nodded and said I'd take care of it. She seemed satisfied and walked back to her house. Here's where the malicious compliance kicked in. See, she was absolutely right about one thing. As the property owner, I was responsible for maintaining my driveway, and that included deciding who could and couldn't use it. I called a fencing company the next day. I explained the situation and asked for a quote on installing a gate at the entrance of my driveway, right where it met the main road. They came out, took measurements, and gave me a reasonable price. I signed the contract immediately. While I was at it, I also called the gravel company and scheduled them to come fix up the driveway properly, fill in the potholes, and add a fresh layer of gravel throughout. If I was going to maintain my property, I was going to do it right. The fence company installed a beautiful gate over the next few days. It was a solid 6-foot-tall wooden gate that swung open from the center with a sturdy lock. I had them install it right at the property line where my driveway started. On my side of the gate, I put up a clearly visible private property, no trespassing sign. The neighbor's wife noticed the construction but didn't say anything at first. I think she assumed I was just putting up a decorative entrance or something. The gravel truck showed up next and spent a full day working on the driveway, making it look better than it had in years. It wasn't until I installed the lock on the gate that she came storming over. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I calmly explained that I was maintaining my property exactly as she had demanded. The driveway was now properly graveled and maintained, and I had secured it with a gate to prevent unauthorized use and trespassing. She turned red and started yelling that she needed access to that driveway. I asked why she would need access to my private driveway on my private property. She sputtered something about it being the only reasonable way to get to the back of her property. I pointed out that she had her own property and could create her own access if she needed it. That's when the truth came out. See, her property had access from a different road, a smaller side street that ran behind our properties. But that road was unpaved and rougher, and it would require her to drive around an extra quarter-mile to get to her backyard. She had been planning to use my driveway as a shortcut to access her back property line because it was more convenient. The previous owners had apparently let her predecessors do this occasionally, and she had assumed that right came with the house. She threatened to sue me. I told her to go ahead, that I had all the documentation showing the driveway was on my property, and I had every right to restrict access to it. I also reminded her that she had been trespassing and blocking my access for weeks, which my attorney would be happy to bring up in court. Her husband came over later that evening, much more reasonable than his wife. He apologized for the whole situation and admitted they had made assumptions about the property access. He asked if we could work out some kind of arrangement where they could occasionally use the driveway. I told him I'd consider it, but first, I needed an apology from his wife and compensation for the time I had been blocked from my own property. She never apologized. Instead, they hired someone to create a new access road on their property from the back street. It cost them several $1,000s to clear the path, lay gravel, and make it usable year-round. I heard her complaining to another neighbor about the expense and how unreasonable I was being. The best part came a few months later. The county was doing some property tax reassessments, and the assessor needed to verify property lines. Both of our properties were reviewed. During this process, it came out that not only was my driveway completely on my land, but a portion of her fence that she had installed along what she thought was the property line was actually about 3 feet onto my property. The county sent her a notice that she needed to move her fence to the correct property line. She had to hire a surveyor, confirm the boundaries, and then pay to have the fence relocated. More expense, more hassle, all because she refused to accept the documented property lines from the start. I eventually installed an automatic gate opener for my convenience. Every time I drive through now, I make sure the gate closes completely behind me. She has to watch me come and go with easy access while she takes her longer route around the back. The whole situation taught me an important lesson about dealing with unreasonable people. Sometimes the best response to ridiculous demands is to comply with them so completely and literally that it exposes just how wrong they were. She demanded I maintain my property, and I did, in a way that made absolutely clear whose property it was and who had the right to use it. My driveway has never looked better, and I've never had another problem with unauthorized parking. The neighbors keep to themselves now, and I keep to mine. Sometimes I see her looking at my nice maintained driveway with its convenient gate as she heads out the long way to her back property, and I can't help but smile a little. The first one is a petty revenge story. I was out running errands and decided to fill up my tank since I was low. I pulled into a gas station owned by Mart that does not sell walls, since I had a membership. One thing to note is that typically during the daytime, it's always packed since the gas station is on a busy road that leads in and out of town. My car is a Volvo, so the gas tank is on the passenger side instead of the driver's side. Enough context onto the story. I try to pull up in line because I notice someone finishing up. The cars are facing opposite to me because their tanks are normal. The driver in front of me finishes up, and I notice the pump behind them is also finishing up, and there's only one car, a red van, behind them. I decided to let both pass so the second didn't get trapped between me and the van. Right as the second car was pulling past, the red van decided to pull all the way up, taking the pump I intended on using. I tap my horn and smile politely, thinking she hadn't seen me and was wanting to leave room behind. Little did I know this was our Karen. I didn't think she'd heard me the first time, so I honk my horn again, maybe half a second this time. She glares over her shoulder and starts getting out. I roll my window down and poke my head out to have a short interaction. Me: "Excuse me, ma'am, can you back up?" Karen: dismissive: "Just go around." Me: "I can't, my thing is on the other side." Karen: exacerbated and rude: "Ugh, I don't back up for anyone." "Okay then, if that's how you want to play, then fine." I make sure there isn't going to be a line behind her, then pull my car as close as I can towards the pump. This blocks her in while still leaving room behind me for cars to pass. A truck did pull up behind her after a minute or so, but he finished up by the time she had. As Karen gets back into her car, only then did she notice how I'd moved. The truck backed out, leaving her a clear and unobstructed path. She glared daggers at me and sat in her car, waiting. At this point, I'd parked and turned off my car. I wasn't under a time constraint, so I could wait this grunt out as long as I needed. After another minute or so, she gets out and approaches my window. I crack it slightly so she can ask me to move. "Sorry, ma'am, I don't back up." Then I go back to watching r/tell Hugo I said hi. She huffs back to her car and slowly backs out, and I get to fill my tank with a smug smile and a story. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So I served 20 years in the Air Force, and this story is from 1996. We were an atypical unit where our mission was always deployed. Not airframe related at all, but rather like the Army. We all trained with multiple weapons. We trained in convoy protocols. We set up our equipment and covered it all with camouflage netting. We dug our own foxholes. We pulled our own security, etc. You get the idea. All of this was as a self-supporting unit, all designed to be operated outside any base if need be. We had about 250 people at any given time, and like any unit, not everyone took it seriously. This story happened on the first 3 days of a deployment to Denmark for a NATO Partnership for Peace exercise, when meant a 2-day convoys from our base. I didn't participate directly, but I heard firsthand from those who did as it was happening and heard and saw the fallout, which wasn't severe, but it was very satisfying for myself. I worked radar maintenance, and after all hands went on deck for our equipment set up on a cliff overlooking the North Sea, we split into 2 12-hour shifts for the rest of the deployment. I had known a senior airman who outranked me since we were both in technical school 3 years prior, and this assignment was our second assignment, and it was nice to have a friend in the new unit, especially since it was my first deployment. We were both on night shift, as was A's girlfriend and future wife. KK wasn't in our work center, but whenever A and K had free time, they were together. We came off shift and hit breakfast, and K was complaining about getting reamed at shift change. Now K's supervisor was a somewhat crusty Master Sergeant V, and apparently he expected coffee to be ready by the time he arrived. Now most of us in the service love coffee. We need coffee. The 6 of us working nights in our work center went through 1 1/2 percolators, 30-cup reservoir, a night. Like if you have ever read a Jack Reacher book, his coffee preferences was exactly what it was like. The problem was that Kay and the one coworker she had on nights didn't drink coffee, so they didn't think of making it, and they also didn't think they should have to make coffee for someone else when they got 0 benefit. So that first breakfast after our night shifts began, they decided they would maliciously comply with MSG V's order to have coffee ready when he came on shift. The next night, they intentionally used the amount of coffee for a standard drip pot you'd use at home, despite every work center having the same 30-cup percolators. So when shift change happened, the first thing MSGV said was, "You better have coffee ready." And they both nodded and gave a, "Yes, sir," and walked out the door, knowing they made the weakest brown water tea that would be considered undrinkable, and it would take another 15 minutes of anger-induced waiting by MSGV to have a decent cup of joe that he'd still have to make himself. Both A and myself were laughing when they relayed this to us at breakfast. That afternoon at shift change, MSG-V tore into K and her coworker, and she came over to vent to A as soon as V was off shift. Apparently he raged about half of his 12-hour shift because a couple different people on day shift told K how angry and grumpy V was. Well, K told us he yelled loud enough that others came to see if there was a fight once she told V they weren't coffee drinkers, so they didn't know how to use a percolator. He ended his second reaming with, "Figure it out," and stomped off. After venting and a hug and kiss from A, Kay said she'd make him a stronger pot of coffee with a much different smile than her normal one. It didn't look sarcastic, but it was twice as big as normal, and I realized she was going to enjoy what she was going to do. So she went and filled the percolator basket to the brim with coffee and turned it on. This was the beginning of a 12-hour shift, and as soon as it finished, she unplugged it and took it outside and took the top off to cool in the chilly North Sea nighttime air. Once it was room temperature, she refilled the basket to the brim, put the lid on, and took it inside to restart the percolator using the coffee that was already in it. She got 4 cycles in that night, in between her duties, which were minimal, as her system was rather new and much less labor-intensive than ours, and we were using our night shift to train us new guys, so we had much less free time. A and I found ourselves outside at shift change, on purpose. We found a way to make ourselves busy and let the others do the shift briefing. About a minute or two after MSGV arrived, you could hear the faint shouting from across the dirt road and patch of field that separated our work center from the rest of the squadron. 2 minutes later, Kay and her co-worker walked out with their heads down, and after about 20 paces turned to see if anyone was still watching. Then they started laughing hard enough to notice from just their silhouettes in the morning sun rising behind them. Kay came running to us, and I stepped back and let her tell of the story, which her co-worker again relayed to me at breakfast. Here it is, still etched in my mind nearly 30 years later. MSGV practically kicked in the door to the 580 shelter that functioned as their mobile work center. He immediately went to the coffee pot and scowled, "This better be stronger than yesterday." Kay just replied, "It should be," and turned to walk about before being angrily told, "Wait." She was actually happy that he was already mad. He took a styrofoam cup and poured a dark black cup of coffee that looked like motor oil pouring out of an engine block that was several thousand miles past due for its change. It even had a faint burnt smell. V let out a, "What's this?" and took a sip and turned and sputtered it out of his mouth, out the still open door of the shelter. Well, most of it went out the door, but some dribbled out and hit his uniform shirt and pants. Good thing brown is one of the woodland camouflage colors. He raged for half a minute and stomped back and opened a coffee percolator to see the ground's practically overflowing basket. He raged some more about wasting resources to order them out of his sight before he could do something he'd regret. After they walked out the door, he took his cup to toss out the undrinkable coffee and raged again and the amount of grounds at the bottom. And he still had to wait another 15 minutes to get a drinkable cup of joe. We were well outside the exercise wire before he could enjoy it. Well, A and I were back outside as soon the shift briefing ended that afternoon, waiting for K to come share the full fallout. Apparently, MSGV dropped the coffee percolator trying to empty it, and was so mad he didn't speak the rest of his shift until the afternoon shaft change briefing. But he told Kay and her co-worker not to bother making coffee. She said good thing because she had a fiber laxative she was going to put in the pot if she had to make it one more time. She said it with that same smile she had the first morning that made me decide I didn't want to get on her bad side. They all made up about it later, and MSG.V even laughed about it during the post-deployment BBQ the night before we packed up to convoy home. Kay made sure she kept his beer stein full all night though, so it probably helped his mood. Anyway, thank you for watching.